My name is Joe Delaney. I was a resident of Barrington Walk, which is on the Lancaster West Estate, part of which was Grenfell Tower. I was evacuated on the night of the fire, and I'm still in temporary accommodation 2 and a bit years later.
Why is that? Have you been offered somewhere that's been not suitable? I mean, obviously, we would like to think that all of those have been offered decent accommodation nearby, which is equivalent, at least, to where they were before.
Well, you see, that's what the problem is. It's the equivalency issue. I mean, the flat I'm in, I didn't even look at this place before they offered it to me. I'd had a year in a hotel by that point. I moved into it in June last year. I'd had a year in a hotel by that point, and frankly, I was fed up with hotels. I mean, the staff at the Novotel Hammersmith were lovely, but it just wasn't a home, and it was very difficult with me, for me and sort of doing anything while I was in a hotel, especially with pets. So they offered it to me. I accepted it without even seeing the place. I was saying, no, I'm going to go for that one. Thank you. I was promised a like-for-like tenancy. And then as time has gone on and I've been more settled, what they've been doing is slowly saying to me, oh, by the way, we can't give you this particular guarantee. So the first thing was right to buy. So I was like, okay, I'll waive that. Then the second thing was matching the rent of Lancaster West Estate, because that's what we were promised. I was like, okay, I can waive that. And now they're saying I won't have a secure tenancy. So I even agreed to that. I said, all right, I will acquiesce to that one. And now they're saying that I can't have a perpetual tenancy, which is what I had before.
Okay, well, this sounds appalling, but who is they?
Kensington and Chelsea Council.
Now, Kensington and Chelsea Council was supposed to be responsible for Grenfell Tower. Obviously, they weren't being responsible. So this really is coming back to the same mismanagement.
Oh, it is, absolutely. I mean, what they did in the immediate aftermath of the fire was they shut down their housing register. And anyone who was on the housing register, they said, sorry, we can't deal with your cases at the moment. We're prioritising Grenfell. Now, that makes no logical sense whatsoever, because let's say they had a property that wasn't suitable for anyone who was there. Let's say it was a one-bedroom place and all they had left were families. Well, why still keep your common housing register closed? And they knew damn well what they were doing. They were trying to build an us and them type thing, and it's the narrative they've constantly filled. You know, if someone says something erroneous about them online, on Facebook or on Twitter or on something, they're immediately out correcting the record. But they're quite happy for people to blame residents of Grenfell or residents of Lancaster West who were evacuated.
What you're suggesting here is that Kensington and Chelsea Council are seeing this as a kind of image management problem rather than a housing issue.
They are. I mean, you can check the media I did in the immediate aftermath of the fire. That was my phrase. I said, look, Kensington and Chelsea Council are and I don't call them the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They don't deserve that title anymore. I only wish that, Buckingham Palace would see it the same way. But yeah, K&C Council do see it that way. I said they're managing a PR disaster. We're living in a humanitarian disaster that they created, and they don't care. All they were interested in is what virtue signalling acts could they undertake that made them look good, and that's what they've been doing.
What about the stay put policy? That's come in for a lot of criticism, that the firefighters that turned up on the scene, I mean, one would have thought that anyone managing that fire would see fairly quickly as the fire spread up the building, around the building, enveloped the building.
I mean, you can check my statement, which is on the Grenfell Inquiry website. And as one of the articles of evidence I submitted was my 999 call. Because I had an app on my phone that recorded calls and even received or made calls. It recorded them. So it recorded the 999 call. I made the call at 1:27, I think it was. I got through at 1:34 or 1:35 because the 999 service was so overwhelmed with calls. And I declared it a major incident at that point. So, I mean, the Met Police and I both declared it at that point. I could see it as an amateur. I've done emergency planning work in the past, and I could see that by 1:30, It's in my statement, black and white. By 1:30, I knew people were going to die. But I didn't want to say that in front of people. So I went and quietly rang 999, and I was like, you need to deploy everything. This is a serious incident. This is, we need to treat it as such. We need a response of all responders. All responders need to be here now dealing with this. And, because then the major incident protocols are meant to kick in. And I know how to do that because I've done work on the Notting Hill Carnival in the past. And we learned how to do that when I was at Brent. And the 999 staff, and this is in Morbick's report, the 999 staff just were not taking things seriously at the time.
I mean, one would have thought that they would be overwhelmed with calls. They would realise something very serious was happening.
Well, they were. They were overwhelmed with calls, but still they just weren't taking people seriously. And what I find most, the most shocking element of that evidence was the fact that even people who are ringing them from inside the tower, for example, and saying, I'm on floor 21 or 22 and there's smoke on my floor and I can't get outside. Even those people, they weren't taking seriously. And that was that was one of the reasons that it took so long for the disaster to be scaled up. I mean, the guy who was there initially, Michael Dowden, he was completely out of his depth. Is this a fire manager or something? Yeah, this was a firefighter who was he was watch commander initially. Now, he is qualified to deal with fires that are known as, he's allowed a maximum of a 2-pump fire, as they call it. 2-pump fire means 2 engines is what's needed for the response. Immediately that night, that was a 6-engine fire. And it went up, I believe, at most to 20-something engines were in the area dealing with it. So from the outset, he was out of his depth. It was the first time he'd ever commanded anything like that. And what he was expected to do on his first command was throw the rule book that he was taught out the window. So I don't agree with the position he took, but I can understand why he took it.
So why was there no one senior? Why was no one senior brought in quickly?
Why was there no one senior brought in quickly? Is it anything to do with the fact that, there were 10,000 firefighters in this country in 2005, and I think we're barely over 5,000 now at the moment, and that's why I found Boris Johnson's, Prime Minister Johnson's speech today in the Commons to be particularly insulting to us in the area and to the memories of those who died, because he's saying, the authorities let them down. Well, Prime Minister Johnson might be saying the authorities let us down. The problem is that it was Mayor Johnson who cut the fire service in London. And when he was questioned about that by Andrew Dismore at the London Assembly, this is online, when Andrew Dismore raised safety concerns and said, have you sort of assessed these cuts that you're planning to implement? Because it was something like 27 fire stations have been closed in London. And so that complement amount of personnel has gone as well. When Andrew Dismore asked him questions on that, he just said to him, get stuffed. That was his exact response to a member of GLA, Greater London Authority representative questioning the mayor on this issue. Get stuffed.
But one would have thought
that just speaks volumes of him.
Joe, one would have thought that firefighters who were coming back out of the building would be saying pretty quickly, and even someone observing as the fire spread up the building, round the building, that staying put was not going to be an option, one would have thought.
Well, but remember that they work within a command structure. So they are reporting back what was happening. But another issue was that the sort of communications infrastructure at the time completely fell apart. There's one thing that can be done in this country in emergency situations. Obviously, in an emergency, everyone's going to be on their mobile phone. And what you can actually do as an emergency responder is you can have your calls prioritized. So basically, your phone is given priority by the local network masts compared to, the average person on the street. So whilst they might be live tweeting what's happening, if you need to ring the control center for something, it's your call that gets prioritized as opposed to theirs. None of this infrastructure was used at the time or utilized. And this was an issue they had at the time.
So you're saying that the commander on the ground is trying to speak to other people away from the scene to get advice?
Because the network was congested. They couldn't communicate with each other there, and sort of signal back to HQ that, we need this, that and the other. They said in the end they were trying to rely on email because at least they could send an email and it would sit in their outbox until they had a signal.
Amazing.
And it could be sent.
I mean, this is incredible, isn't it? In one of the biggest capitals in the world, such as firefighters cannot communicate with the fire station. I mean, I think if you went back to the 1950s, they could do it quite easily.
Well, I mean, yeah, but you see, even back in the 1950s, there was a system that's in place for landlines. And basically, in a civil emergency, if phones are being overused, but I don't know if you've ever tried to ring the speaking clock on New Year's Eve, just before midnight. Any other time you get put straight through to the speaking clock. That's the one time where if you ring it, it's engaged. And it's literally because there's only so many lines physically they can connect to a particular number. And that's just the science of it. And it's the same with radio spectrum. There's only a certain part of the radio spectrum that's used for mobile calls. And once so many phones are using that amount of spectrum, there's nothing left physically. And that's why what you need is a prioritization system where certain phones that are pinging the network can say, no, my call needs to be dealt with before anyone else's.
So what do you make of Commander Cotton, who has said that she doesn't think there's anything actually to learn from this?
Well, I mean, she backtracked on that last week when it was last week or the week before when she spoke to the Greater London Authority. And she did say that maybe stay put needs looking at. But even there, you can still see there is this intransigence in the London Fire Service. And that's the distinction that needs to be made. The London Fire Service let people down that night. London firefighters did not. They did their best. I was there that night. I saw them when they finally were able to get into that building. Some of them went in without breathing apparatus. Some of them went in without helmets. They just wanted to get in and try and do good. There's one firefighter in particular, David Badillo. He was the one who was basically, he risked his own life several times and against sort of operational protocol trying to find Jessica O'Byrne on the 21st or 22nd floor. And I mean, they were fighting a losing battle. There was only so much an individual firefighter can do without stepping outside the control authority. And
sounds
one thing
like
that's drilled into them is, follow the rules, follow your orders.
Sounds like maybe something wrong with the systems by which people are put in charge. I wonder whether maybe some of the individuals who are firefighters would have been should have been listened to more.
Well, I mean, if you look, that's why. If you look, I can't remember the chap's name, but it was like the second or third. No, it was the third or fourth person who ended up being in charge of the incident. And from the moment he came in, that's the reason why a good friend of mine's father, his name is Antonio Roncolata, he was rescued from his property at 5 a.m. And it was once someone who actually was qualified to do, to call the shots properly in these sorts of circumstances and was seasoned enough and had the training to deal with this, was put in charge, the operation changed. But sadly, for a lot of the victims by that point, they'd been poisoned by the toxic smoke, Virtually everyone who came out of that tower was treated for cyanide poisoning.
I mean, this was caused, of course, by this flammable cladding.
Yes.
The real cause of the fire was this, not the failures of the Fire Brigade.
That's it. It's Celotex FR5000 insulation and the cladding that surrounded that.
I mean, looking at how that was put in place, it's a pretty horrific story in itself. There's a Kensington and Chelsea Conservative councillor called Rock Fielding Mellon who was intimately involved with that. He was deputy leader of the council. He was deputy leader of the council, and basically he just decided that the project was overrunning. I mean, you have to remember, initially when they said £9 million, Leadbitters, who were the favoured contractor at the time, said, we can't do it for this much. And so rather than actually looking at the project and saying, are they being honest or are they just trying to inflate the prices,
The council just went out and re-tendered and brought in Ryden, who said they could do it for this amount. And then when even Ryden were getting cost overruns, he went through the thing line by line and against EU procurement regulations, because all of this had been agreed in the tender that had been published. We're going to use this material for this and we're going to use that material for that. He then went through and arbitrarily changed it all himself. So he was the one who changed the type of cladding.
I mean, but surely the contractors, it's actually down to them, to make sure that the regulations are enforced. It's not down to an individual councillor who's trying to cut the costs. If he says, we should go down to a cheaper... surely his job is to say, maybe we can cut the cost on this. Surely it's the contractor's job to say, no, you can't do that. It's against regulations.
No, there was nothing against regulations about it. That's another problem. But it wasn't stuff that was advised to be used. But it wasn't that, the way the regulations work was it was inadvisable to use this material. It was not illegal to do so.
So what's happened, what's happened to Rock Fielding Mellon, who's the specific person who's behind the decision to use the flammable cladding?
Absolutely nothing. At the moment, the police have said now they're not going to prosecute until the inquiry is finished. That decision beggars belief to me. They could at least do some prosecutions. I get the big fish like Rockfield and Mellon, you might want to leave. But there are ones lower down the rung that you could get very quickly, and it would at least give people in the community some hope that, things are progressing. You don't need to wait and get all of them at the end. You can get some right now.
So who do you think, not necessarily naming names, but, you can if you want, but who are there specific?
If you check my Twitter feed at Jodaphone UK on Twitter, you'll see I have 2 pinned tweets where I name companies that I believe are wholly responsible. Emma Dent Code, the MP for Kensington, today she actually named individuals within those companies because she said it's unfair that firefighters have been named when all of these company executives haven't. And so she actually spent about 5 minutes today in Parliament naming them all and their salaries and their job titles and the role that they played.
And so what were their roles? What were these companies?
Well, there were companies like Celotex, the ones who were responsible for the insulation. There was Arconic, who were responsible for the cladding and plastics. There was Ryden, the contractor. There was Harley Facades, who fitted the cladding. There was Cadent, the national grid operator. Their chap took the stand the same week that Robert Black from the TMO took the stand. Robert Black was the Thursday of that week. I think the Cadent guy was the Tuesday or Wednesday. And the Cadent guy said we couldn't cut the gas off because it was the emergency shut-off for the tower had been covered up during renovation works. And then I didn't know where any of the other shut-offs were in the area because the infrastructure map we got was inaccurate. And then when I did find a shut-off point, I didn't think it was safe to shut it off because it may have just caused a build-up on the system, which would have resulted in an overload in the gas system, and that would have caused an explosion elsewhere. This is ridiculous. I'm sure you've seen videos on YouTube where people are walking along and all of a sudden a manhole cover explodes as they're just walking along the street. The reason that things like that are happening is because the infrastructure, our critical national infrastructure for gas and electricity and water, aren't treated in that way.
So,
they're treated as commodities which are traded by hedge funds.
Yes, it seems that much of this may be linked to privatisation, Joe.
Privatisation, yes. To give you a good example of a problem with privatisation, the Building Research Establishment. Their job is to inspect and test materials and, scenarios about building safety and construction methods and things like that. They were privatised by the Blair government in 98 or 99, if memory serves. And at that point, for them, it didn't become about they weren't a safety company from that point onwards. Because this market was liberalised, as it's known, all of a sudden it wasn't about which safety company should I opt for? The question became, which safety company will give me the answer that I want? The TMO's tender for a fire safety inspector for their properties actually said they wanted someone who would be a powerful voice to stand up and challenge the findings of London Fire Brigade. So in other words, we think that what they're asking us for is too onerous. So we want someone who'll push back and say, no, it doesn't need to be that strict or stringent or, that sort of regulated. We can deal with it more laissez-faire.
I mean,
it's the same, it's the same issue that we have with the banks and the auditors, where basically the bank, the auditors don't like speaking truth unto power because the power are the ones who hold the purse strings and are paying them. And if your auditor gives you too much awkward findings every year, all you'll do is you'll get a brand new one the following year, won't you? And then they've lost the work.
And who audits the auditors?
Yeah, and that's it.
I mean, I've come across a similar thing myself, obviously not as bad as Grenfell, but where fire escapes have been metal gated up so you can't actually get out through the fire escapes. The reason being given is that heroin addicts have been getting into certain parts of buildings where they shouldn't be, and then complaints made by residents to London Fire Brigade, and they say, well, actually, we're having to fight some legal person from the housing association that says actually these fire escapes must be boarded up so that they can't be used. To all of your listeners, I would say this. You can demand a free fire inspection from your local fire authority, regardless of where you are in the country. If you're London, Manchester, Yorkshire, Cornwall, Cambridge, anywhere at all, find out who your local authority. Just put in the name of your area and put in fire brigade and then home safety inspection. Everyone is entitled to one for free. If you feel that there are issues, get them now fighting with you. Because they are actually more on the ball now than they were, and you can demand a fire safety inspection for free, as I say. And if they identify defects, they issue what's known as a deficiency notice to your landlord. But of course the real problem is that we don't have legal aid anymore. That was the problem that the Grenfell Action Group faced. It was like, well, what are you going to do? That's it, tough. And that was literally the response that we got at times when we raised concerns. One of the biggest... I mean, I don't know how people talk about the incident, whether it's talked about more as a tragedy or an atrocity, Joe, because when you look at the flagged-up warnings before the fire saying how unsafe the buildings were and how various safety procedures and safety systems had been jerry-rigged and just not really properly done at all with pipes, for example, running up and down stairwells rather than through ducting, that sort of thing. There actually was wording along the lines, I'm paraphrasing here, saying, well, it's going to take a massive disaster with enormous loss of life, such as a fire.
That was Francis O'Connor.
For anyone to do anything.
Yeah, that was Francis O'Connor on the Grenfell Action Group blog, grenfellactiongroup.wordpress.com, and he wrote that piece in November 2016. And ironically, that was the same month that the fire service did send a deficiency notice to the TMO, which was the Kensington and Chelsea Council's arm's length, and it was arm's length in name only because K&C completely called the shots. It's managing agent for the properties. But you see, because we didn't have legal aid, we couldn't challenge anything that they were telling us. At one point, they wrote, the reason I got to know Francis and Ed behind the Grenfell Action Group blog was I'd moved on to the estate and they were threatened with libel action by the council. The council was saying, we're going to sue you for libel because of all the horrible things you're saying about us. And it was only because of my job at another council in the area. I was head of insurance and risk at a neighbouring borough. I was like, well, councils can't sue for libel. That was established in 1992, Times newspapers versus Derbyshire County Council. So they can't threaten you with libel. And when I went back and pushed back, all they then said was, well, we're going to fund individual council officers to sue you for libel because you're saying horrible things about them. And that's totally illegal for them to do as well. They cannot use public funds in that manner. Well, what about the tax implications of doing that? What happens if they lose? Who's going to pay the costs? So you're going to cover the costs as well. You don't have that authority as a council to use public money in that fashion.
It sounds like a landlord that's creating a hostile environment for tenants. Oh,
it's not that. It's a public authority that just seems to. It's more. They feel they're more about the authority than they are about the public part. They forget they're public servants. That's it. They're not there to serve us. We're there to be managed. And that's why it's ironic. It was the tenant management organisation. It wasn't a housing management organisation. It was a tenant management organisation. I think subconsciously, when that was set up, and its first registered address, by the way, was Kensington and Chelsea Town Hall, Horton Street, WA. You can look at that on Company's House. You see, whoever set that up subconsciously knew what they were planning from the outset.
Well, there's been a big pushback here in Bristol against TMOs for probably something like 10, 15 years now, because people who've been working in housing professionally have made sure they didn't happen, and that they campaigned very strongly against them, seeing them as a sort of Trojan horse, really, in order to part privatise in the way that local authorities would find acceptable. But look, you've mentioned a few times this whole thing of legal aid. That does sound like, that all changed with the coalition government, Ken Clarke getting rid of that. So how has that affected people? Not just yourself, Joe.
That was LESPO, I believe it's called, the Legal Aid Sentencing Powers or something like that Act. LASPO, I'm sure it was the acronym for it. That's caused so much injustice. Because, what little chance you had of holding these people to account is now gone, unless you sort of, you have unlimited wealth.
Yeah, but you've got the public inquiry that you wanted.
We've got the public inquiry we wanted, I have to say. Sir Martin Morbick, you know what? I kind of owe him a slight apology in some ways, because, I wasn't being deliberately harsh on him just for the sake of malice. I wanted to keep his, I wanted to keep him on his toes because I wanted him to do the right thing. And I have to say that in the Phase 1 report, broadly speaking, that's what's happened. The fact that if you read the entire report, it is absolutely damning. And it's just unfortunate that the Telegraph were the ones who had the first leak of the report. And so they were the ones who framed the argument.
Well, that's interesting because they're sympathetic to the Conservative Party, aren't they?
Yes. Oh, not just sympathetic to the Conservative Party. Don't forget, Mr. Johnson is on their payroll. They give him £250,000 of chicken feed a year for writing the occasional article for them. So it's awfully coincidental that they were the ones who got the copy first of all. And clearly they got that copy quite early in the day for them to have put that out that evening. So my theory is that the only people who got that report, besides us core participants, we were given physical paper copies, by the way. I understand that Downing Street was given the digital version. And the fact that the Telegraph had a copy so quickly would lead me to indicate that it was a digital copy they had. And there was only one of those available, and it was at Downing Street. So I'm firmly of the opinion that it was Downing Street that leaked it because they want it. And the fact that the Telegraph framed it as firefighters are to blame just, reinforces that belief of mine.
But the inquiry hasn't...
firefighters blamed? It's Boris Johnson.
The inquiry hasn't finished yet. What are we going to be seeing in the coming weeks and months? Given
the way that Morbick has dealt with Phase 1, I think we're going to see some very interesting things coming out in Phase 2. I have a lot more confidence in Sir Martin Morbick now than I did on the day he was appointed when I first met him.
But we've seen that there are other buildings with this same cladding still on them, Joe.
Yes, there are. And now that issue there is absolutely disgraceful. I'm sorry, if you're someone who built a block and you have sold flats within that block, in any other country, look, they're saying that they didn't know that this stuff was defective, and they were just relying on safety tests, which is fair enough. But what that would be then considered in legal terms, and this is me speaking with my insurance hat on again, it's what's known as a latent defect. And a latent defect is one that you could not reasonably have known about unless you sort of tested something to absolute destruction, which would be seen as unreasonable. That's fair enough. But in most other common law countries, if a latent defect is identified, liability lies with the seller. In Britain, it relies on the buyer under the principle of caveat emptor. That desperately needs to change. It's only when these people are threatened in the pocket. If they're threatened in the pocket or with prison, that's when you'll get them on side. And that's what we need to do. Corporate manslaughter doesn't work in this country. There's not been a company that's got, say, more than 50 employees or 100 employees that has ever had a successful corporate manslaughter charge against it. And the reason is the threshold of corporate manslaughter is you have to show a controlling mind. And you're not going to do that in a big multinational multi-billion-dollar a year company. There's not someone sitting in some executive office on the top floor somewhere, twirling their moustache as they, make these evil decisions and laughing maniacally. It's a succession of decisions that are taken that lead to these issues. And that's why that threshold is ridiculous. So what you should do is either we have a named officer, either we can hang them all together, or there is one that can be identified who can be hanged separately. Because then, believe me, they will make damn sure that things comply. A story I always rely on is the Chinese government with the Millennium Bug. There was concerns about, planes falling out of the sky and everything. So the Chinese government passed a law, and it said that all airplane executives had to be in the air at midnight. You see, and so all of a sudden now they had a damn good incentive to make sure that their planes were safe and would comply and wouldn't have any issues, regardless of what may happen on the ground.
And I suppose,
and I think that's what we need. We need that moral hazard reintroduced into corporate business. Because at the moment, to quote the great literary piece that is Shrek, the first film, as the Lord guy in that says when he's sending the knights off on a dangerous quest, he's like, yes, it's dangerous, and some of you may die, but that is a risk I'm willing to take. And that's it. And that's the situation we're in now. It's absolutely farcical.
So the fact is that we have flammable cladding on buildings. This can happen again, potentially. Yes,
it can. It can indeed. Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. It will happen again. Look, we were lucky. It happened. We were lucky that nothing happened in Barking at the fire very recently. We were lucky that it didn't happen at the other one that's occurred since Grenfell. And the reason it's happened since then is that people are sort of on their toes. And thankfully, no one is listening to stay put advice anymore. And they're getting the hell out the moment there is the remotest suspicion of anything going wrong. It's certainly, they're not getting out now because the instructions have changed. And, the instructions aren't going to change until people are found liable. And so we're in this ridiculous situation now where they feel that, we can't change things because, that might be seen as an admission of liability.
I mean, it seems to me also that you've got the justice of this. In other words, people paying the price, going to jail, etc., for causing this fire, for willfully ignoring warnings, that sort of thing, who were supposed to be responsible, who were happy to take the money to do their jobs, but then when it came to the actual responsibility of the job, they looked the other way. That does not look as if it's still not really happening yet, Joe, and it might be quite a long way down the line, mightn't it?
It's not, but that's why I said, you see, we need to say this in the way that, there are more, look, if you run a charity, within your charity you have to name someone as finance officer, and that person can be held personally liable for any losses that charity incurs. And so that's why charity finance officers make damn sure that there's nothing iffy in the account because, it's their personal assets that will be at stake. This is what we need. We need in corporate, we need in our world of business and trade, we need these people to have some real skin in the game because if they don't, then, that's it. Some of you may get hurt, but it's a risk I'm willing to take.
Joe Delaney, thanks very much for joining us.
You're most welcome. Take care.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.